our fourth edition of STEM Week. Today we have, let me see, the talk given by Dr. Ollie Teal, which is called Intelligent Mobility, the Future of Transport. Dr. Oliver Teal is the Growth Director for the Intelligent Transport Services discipline in WSP, in which he develops opportunities to improve transport using technology. His professional background incorporates concepts in engineering, research, and business development. Some of his most notable memberships are the CENG in Engineering Council, Member Institution of Civil Engineers, the MICE, and Member Institution of Engineering and Technology, MIET. He graduated in civil engineering at Universitat Politécnica de Catalunya. He later obtained a master's degree in civil engineering at the University of Bristol. And lastly, he pursued a PhD in philosophy at Cardiff University. So, well, welcome to our second day. And thank you, Ollie, for accepting being part of this event. And well, the floor is yours. I think you are available to share your screen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. And let me just share that screen. So there we go. Hopefully, let me know if you can see that. Yeah, all good. Okay, so yes, thank you for inviting me today to talk. I'm Ollie Teal, so I am going to talk about the future of transport and mobility. You've already heard a couple of things about me, but this is me on the right-hand side. I live in Bath in England. That's my wife, Adriana Briceño, who will actually be talking tomorrow on sustainable environmental design. So I recommend you also listen to her talk, which is very interesting. You've heard a little bit about my technical background already. So I'm originally a civil engineer, so I have a master's and a PhD in engineering. And I have worked in the UK transport industry for the last 10 years. Originally working for Costain, who are an engineering contractor, on initially road building schemes and then on innovation and research projects. So things like how connected vehicles can share information with infrastructure and back and forward. Over the last 3 years, I've worked for WSP, who are a global engineering consultancy company with headquarters in Canada, but offices all over the world, including in Mexico, actually, although I've never been to the Mexico office or not yet. And I work in the UK as the growth director for the Intelligent Transport Services division. So today I'll talk about the future of transport in two different sections. I'll first talk about transport today and why we need to change in the first place. And then I'll talk about tomorrow and what the future of transport might look like. So I imagine that most of you listening today will have access to a car and probably use driving as your main means of getting around. That's the most common way of getting around in the world. And I know certainly in Mexico, that's incredibly common. So you might think, well, why do we need to stop doing that? Why can't we just continue to build roads, increase the capacity of our road, and just keep driving around and fuel up our cars using gasoline or diesel every other week or however often you drive? And there are some very good reasons why we can't keep doing that. And here's just a few of the key points. The first one being that driving is actually not very safe when we take into account all of the different reasons that we have incidents on the roads. Around 1.35 million people die on roads each year, which is a very, very high number, and it's almost taken for granted, and we accept that this many people die on the roads, but it doesn't have to be that way. And driving is part of the problem because of the complexity of it and how much human error comes into that. So that's one reason why we might want to change the way we do things. The second, which is also linked to driving in particular, but also other forms of transport, is around air pollution. So air pollution and poor air quality contributes to millions of premature deaths each year. And it's particularly diesel vehicles, but also gasoline vehicles. The emissions caused by those vehicles really do damage people's health and people's internal organs. And the third is around the wider context of climate change and global warming, that transport contributes to around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we really want to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions, then we need to change the way we travel around. So just expanding on that a little bit, I mentioned this 1.35 million deaths per year figure. What I found was really shocking when I started initially looking into this is that it's actually the #1 cause of death for children and young adults in 5 to 29 years of age range is road traffic incidents. So if you think about that, that's more than any other illness you can think of, like cancer or obesity or heart disease. Is actually road traffic incidents that are causing those deaths. And again, we seem to accept that that's the case, but it really shouldn't be. Air pollution that I mentioned is actually quite difficult to really estimate the number of people who this affects, but it's estimated that somewhere around above 3 million people a year die as partially as a cause of air pollution, and that the air pollution or the transport emissions that cause poor air quality, around 50% of those come from transport. So again, it's comes back to the challenge of the fuel we use and the cars that we drive. And on the left-hand side, there's a graph that compares the annual road fatalities per 100,000 inhabitants. And it really depends on where you are as to how big a problem this is. And unfortunately, in Mexico, that's one of the worst, actually. So there's around 5,000 or above 5,500 deaths a year in Mexico due to annual road fatalities. And if you look over the last 10, 20 years, that hasn't really improved per 100,000 inhabitants. So as the population is increasing, actually the number of people who are dying on roads, unfortunately, is also increasing. So the climate emergency, I'm sure all of you on this call will be aware of this already, and will be at least partly informed. But if you follow the news, you'll see more and more extreme weather events occurring as a result of climate change and global warming. Things like wildfires and droughts. In fact, just in the UK over the last week, we've had an unusually high number and intensity of storms, which have caused all sorts of chaos around the country. And transport accounts for about a fifth of the global carbon dioxide emissions, and about 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions, once you take into account things like methane as well. And people seem to think, or they assume, that if we just stop flying, for example, then the problem will go away. But actually, aviation only accounts for just under 12% of those emissions, whereas road transport, road vehicles, is just under 75%. So it's the vast majority of those emissions. So it's actually, rather than making a few very big changes, it's about lots of people making small changes in their own life, because the reason those emissions are so high from road transport is just because of the sheer number of road vehicles that are causing those emissions. And the third or the final point I wanted to make about why we need to change was actually around quality of life. So as around the world, we're seeing rapid urbanization, and Mexico is a good example of that, actually. Over the last 50, 60 years, the rapid urbanization of the population from rural environments into urban environments has been quite enormous, really, and is set to continue. And that puts a real strain on city infrastructure, not just transport infrastructure, but all different services. But in terms of transport infrastructure, that's a real challenge, and it comes down to how those cities are then designed and developed as to what effect that might have on how people travel. And the challenge here really is that we should try not to design cities for cars. We should design them for people. A good example of where that hasn't been done is Los Angeles. So I traveled to Los Angeles several years ago, and I was quite used to living in the UK and traveling around in cities here. In most cities, it's quite easy to get around using public transport, be that train or bus. But in Los Angeles, you could really struggle to get anywhere unless you own a car or have access to a car, because everything is so dispersed. There's large roads everywhere. There aren't very easy connections for walking or for and bus systems are unreliable. So that whole city has been designed for cars. And a good example of how that can change is on the right-hand side with New York City in Times Square. So back in 2010, they started looking at pedestrianizing that area. And it took several years over several stages, but that's now become a permanent change because of the beneficial impact it can have from that top photo to the one below in terms of the use of the space. So when cities are designed for cars, you get more traffic because that's the way you need to get around. Whereas if it's designed for people, then people are incentivized to walk or to use metros or buses to get around because that's the easiest way to do it. So moving the sort of current situation slightly behind, how do we think about the future of transport? Well, we can't accurately or precisely predict the future because if we could, we'd be billionaires. But what we can do is look at the factors that influence change and look at the trends that are emerging to then plan for the future and be able to influence that. So I've mentioned a couple of those things already. So, climate change, but there are also other factors you need to take into account. Things like behavioral and societal change, what people are willing to accept, why people are traveling or whether they are traveling more or traveling less, global trends, people's access to technology and to connectivity, for example, and also people's skills and education. So there's lots of different factors to take into account. So when we're looking at planning for the future or trying to understand what the future might look like, we come up with themes of change. And what I'll do for the remainder of the talk is talk through some of the themes of change that we see, that you can see on the screen here, and give a bit of an overview of what that means, and also a couple of examples in each that will hopefully give you an idea of the sorts of things we see happening in the future. So the themes you can see here: automation, cleaner transport, data and connectivity, new modes and business models, and changing attitudes. So automation is the first theme that I'll talk through. So what I mean by automation is computers or technology taking over some of the role that would typically be or traditionally be done by human beings. And the reason that this is such an important trend or such a widespread trend is that about 90 or over 90% of road traffic incidents have human error as a major factor within them. So the theory is if you remove some of that human error, some of that human influence on driving, you can reduce the number of deaths, you can improve safety. And the other big factor there is convenience and actually enjoyability, or the comfort of you as a driver of a car. That if some of those tasks are automated, you actually enjoy that experience more because it reduces the stress, it reduces the load on you as a human being. And so you've got three vehicles here, which are very different levels of automation, but they're all passenger vehicles. So you have the Model T Ford on the left-hand side, which is the first mass-produced commercial vehicle that you could buy. You have the Tesla Model S in the middle, which is you could buy on the market today. And on the right-hand side is a gateway autonomous pod, which is been used in a number of different scenarios in the UK over the last few years. And when I mean levels of automation, you can see on the bottom of this slide, there's a spectrum of automated driving. Now, because automation is a relatively new idea in transport, there isn't a fixed set of definitions around these levels, but this spectrum is widely recognized as a way of talking about different levels of automation. So the Model T Ford is very much a level 0, as in everything in that car is done by the person. The person is steering, is accelerating and braking, is monitoring the environment. There is no automation within that. A level 1 automated vehicle would be if one of those tasks were to become automated. So say the speed. So one of the earliest kind of cruise control systems would be that you would just tell the car to drive at 50 kilometers per hour and it would continue to drive at that speed. So it's not particularly intelligent, but it is automated. So that's kind of a level 1 automation. Level 2 is then where that gets a little bit more integrated. So it might be that there's an adaptive cruise control that changes speed based on a different factor, or that it can control a bit of the steering, or something like automated parking, for example. That's another function that some cars have. So that would be called a level 2 automated vehicle then. Level 3 is where the Tesla example comes in. So I'm sure you will have seen, Tesla talk about their full self-driving vehicles, but actually what those are level 3 automated vehicles, because while the car is doing self-driving or automated driving, you as a human are there with your hands on the wheel, ready to take over at any moment. And legally, you have to be doing that because you remain responsible for what happens with that car. So if the car gets into an accident, you still remain responsible because you're the driver of the car, even though the car is automated. And so all that is doing really is taking away some of the stress, some of the cognitive load, as it's called, so the pressure on you to be constantly monitoring the environment, but you are the full human backup. Now, the boundary between level 3 and 4 is where it gets really interesting, because a level 4 vehicle is actually what that pod is on the right-hand side. So that's fully automated. It doesn't rely on a human to function, but it only works within a certain controlled environment. It only works in an area that it knows. So currently how that pod works, for example, is that they will drive it around on a test run so it can map the environment, and then it knows what the routes are and knows where to go, and it can do that route on its own. So it's not a completely autonomous vehicle. But if you, for example, were to go and stand in front of it while it was driving, it would see you, it would stop, it would wait for you to get out of the way, and then it would continue on its journey. A level 5 automated vehicle would be one that does that same kind of function, but can do it in any environment, in any situation. And those currently don't exist. There's lots of research projects going on, but there's no such thing as a level 5 automated vehicle on the market yet. And it may be that we never have one, because actually you only really need automation in certain scenarios. So you might not want a fully automated vehicle, but that's another debate. So I mentioned there's lots of research and innovation going on in this space. Here's just a couple of examples. So in Michigan, there's a place called M-City, which is part of the University of Michigan, where there's all sorts of research projects going on. So similar pods to the one I showed on the previous slide, but also more conventional looking vehicles with different levels of automation. And they're doing lots of testing there, and they're working with lots of vehicle manufacturers to do that testing, which is all really interesting. The one below is a similar example. Midlands Future Mobility in the UK is a similar test environment. The difference being there's also live environments there. So the live roads are also used as part of the testing facility, and they've installed lots of testing infrastructure there to show how these vehicles can be safe and can be integrated into normal life. On the left of the bottom picture, that RoboPilot one is quite an interesting example that a company called Arrival are trying to automate and also electrify deliveries. So this is a delivery vehicle that can deliver packages around a city. And so they're trying to create a new business model where they basically don't have to employ drivers. They have a fleet of autonomous vehicles that will deliver packages around the city for you. Currently, that's still a research project, and there's pilots and trials going on, so it's not yet a fully commercial service. And on the right-hand side, I've just thrown this in there because it was a bit of a new development over the last few weeks. A commission in the UK has proposed new laws to come into force around automated vehicles. So I mentioned this sort of level 3 to level 4 and the responsibility of a driver being really important. So when an autonomous or automated vehicle is then fully in control of that vehicle, this report is basically starting to say that, well, it shouldn't be the responsibility of the passenger in the vehicle. That then is an autonomous vehicle, and therefore, if something happens, the person who's responsible isn't the driver, it's then the company who makes the vehicle, for example. And this is the first time that they've actually tried to put this into law. So it isn't yet law, but this is a recommendation for it. And what will that will allow is then companies to start really selling self-driving or automated vehicles that are higher levels of autonomy. So the second theme I wanted to talk about is cleaner transport. And this is a really, really important one. And I'm sure people will have seen things around this already, but I mean, fundamentally, to make transport cleaner, we need to move away from gasoline and diesel. And for example, in the UK, by 2030, it's now going to be illegal to sell new gasoline or diesel cars. So we need alternatives to that. And the main two alternatives that we're seeing at the moment are electric battery-powered vehicles and fuel cell vehicles using compressed hydrogen. Now, you're probably all more familiar with the one on the left, and I'll start with that one in terms of an alternative. So there are lots of different, it's a very widely adopted technology, electric vehicles. You can also get hybrid vehicles, which are obviously partly electric and partly run on gasoline or diesel. They can be zero emission to run if you're using renewable energy, and there's lots of choice for you as a consumer to go and buy one. But there's still quite a few challenges around this. One of the biggest ones is kind of range anxiety, and this is particularly where there isn't enough charging infrastructure. So you're worried about, can you get to your destination and back without having to charge or to run out of fuel? And this is being addressed by having vehicles with longer and longer range, which is happening now. But it's still a challenge in many countries where there isn't enough public charging infrastructure. Cost is still a challenge where most electric vehicles are more expensive than gasoline or diesel vehicles. Energy demand is one for cities, really, where if you're looking to install lots of public charging points around, particularly if they're rapid charging points, there's a high energy demand to that. So you need to understand whether the electrical system, the network, can actually handle that additional demand on the network. Battery weight is one that most people aren't really that aware of, but electric battery-powered vehicles or electric batteries are great for smaller vehicles and even buses. But when you get to larger ones like trucks or even ships and planes, batteries become too heavy to power those effectively, and the battery weight becomes prohibitive. So they're not really at the moment and there's lots of research going on different batteries and next generations of these, but the current battery technology isn't really feasible for vehicles larger than about a bus. Embodied carbon and ethics is also a really interesting one that so people talk about these being zero emission. They are, if you use it, they are to run, but they have a lot of embodied carbon in the actual battery itself, because you have to mine minerals and metals to actually create the battery. And the ethics comes into that, where most of these minerals are currently mined in parts of Africa where ethical standards aren't as high as you would like them to be in some cases, which is really a worry for some of the manufacturers. So hydrogen vehicles, people may not know that much about them because they're not as widespread. The reason that they're a viable alternative is because they have what's called a high energy density. So basically a smaller amount of fuel can make the vehicle go a longer way. So they don't have the same challenge around battery weight, because the batteries can be smaller, or the fuel cells can be smaller. They're also zero emission, but only if you're using renewable energy, and it's a bit more complicated with hydrogen, which we'll get onto in a second. However, they have some of the same challenges as electric vehicles with range anxiety, particularly because even in the UK, for example, there's only about 13 charging stations, I think, across the country. So I wouldn't be able to buy a hydrogen vehicle and get anywhere because there's no charging station near me. They're also still more expensive than gasoline or diesel. Energy conversion is a factor, which again I'll get onto in a second, but there's a process that needs to go through to actually create the hydrogen. There's few options for consumers at the moment, and the emissions depend on where you're getting the hydrogen from. But the reason it still remains viable is mainly because of that energy density, and for larger vehicles that then becomes really important. So just talking a little bit more about electric ones. So we tend to think of small our normal cars, like the one in the middle there. But also buses. There's an increasing number of electric buses around, and there's different ways of charging those buses. So this is an example in the US of an overhead charging station, which can be used while it's stationary, and then gives it enough power to drive its route and then come back again. But if you're buying a vehicle, so I drive an electric car, and it works for me because actually that picture on the bottom there is our home charger. So we had a charger installed at our house because we're lucky enough to have a designated parking space, which we own. But if you don't have a designated parking space, or you live, say, in a flat, or you're renting, then you have to rely on the public charging infrastructure, like the one in the picture above. And the challenge there is that if it exists, first of all, in the city that you live, sometimes they could be unreliable. You can have slow charges or rapid charges. Sometimes they cost more, or they will cost more than a home charger. So that needs to be factored in. So there's a lot of different things you need to think about. So for many people, it's not really that feasible at the moment to transition to an electric vehicle, despite governments around the world trying to incentivize people to change into electric vehicles. And on the right-hand side, there's a map of all the charging stations in the UK at the moment. The different colors are the different types of chargers. So some are slow and some are fast, like I say. So the challenge, you might say, well, there's plenty of chargers across the country. And there are, but the challenge is that a lot of them are made by different manufacturers. So the images on the top, the little icons, are different manufacturer of charging points. You have to have a different account and a different app for most of these chargers. And then often when you get there, some of them won't be working, or they won't have been maintained, or you won't have the right account, or whatever it might be. So it can be a bit frustrating sometimes around that area of it. Now, hydrogen is often misunderstood. And in industry, there are different colors of hydrogen to try and clarify the source of the energy, because there's only really one zero emission hydrogen, which is green hydrogen on the far right hand side. And that's where it's being created using renewable electricity. But the other ones you can see here, so gray and blue hydrogen, is when they've been created using methane or coal, which are non-renewable resources and create greenhouse gases. The difference between them is that with gray hydrogen, the carbon dioxide that's produced is just released into the atmosphere, so it's very unsustainable. With blue hydrogen, that's combined with carbon capture, so you're actually capturing some of that carbon that's released, but not all of it. So it's lower emission, but it's still not renewable. Turquoise hydrogen is an emerging area that hasn't really been proven at scale, but it basically uses a process called pyrolysis, which then creates solid carbon instead of carbon as a gas. So then that can be stored effectively. So it's a low carbon alternative, but it still uses methane as a source. So green hydrogen is the only real renewable version of that. And the challenge with green hydrogen is that this is how it's essentially produced. It's produced using electrolysis, which, so as most of you are probably aware, but hydrogen is the most abundant resource in the world. So if we can tap into it, then it's a very effective fuel source. However, hydrogen is normally you find in H2O in water, and so you need to separate it out using this process of electrolysis to form that compressed pure hydrogen to use as a fuel. So that's what that first production stage is. And if you use renewable energy for that, then it's green hydrogen. And then you have to transport it to wherever you're going to use it. So you need the infrastructure in place, be that pipelines or trucks or shipping or storage, and then you can use it as a fuel. So as I mentioned, it's got very good energy density, but that infrastructure is not really in place at the moment. So I think what we'll see in the future is more use of hydrogen for really large energy demand areas, things like industry and shipping, and potentially large truck usage, but not for smaller vehicles. So the third area I was going to talk about is data and connectivity. So as a general point, I mean, everybody knows now that everyone uses their smartphone for everything. I use my smartphone for everything, including transport. So the general point here is that, the better the data and the connectivity you have, the more reliable information you have, and the more reliable information you have, the more efficient your journeys can be. So as an example, if you're catching a train or a tube, you want to know when that train's going to arrive, if there's any delays, so you can plan your journeys around that. Equally, if you're ordering a taxi or if you're driving, if you're ordering a taxi, you want to know where it is and when it's going to arrive. If you're driving, ideally, you want to know if there's going to be traffic on your journey and whether you should take a different route. All of those things can be done through current technology, but they rely on good data and good connectivity. So that's it's more than an emerging theme, it's an established theme that will continue into the future. And a few examples of things that are happening now around that. So on the right-hand side is a schematic of England. In England, there's on the strategic road network, which is all the major roads in England, there's a service called the National Road Telecommunications Service. Essentially, this uses loads of sensors across the road network, over 100,000 sensors and around 23,000 devices, things like signs and cameras, that are all linked up to 7 regional control centers and 1 national operations center. And what that does is it takes all that data, all that information about what's happening on the road. So where's the traffic at the moment? Have there been any incidents? Are there any lanes that need to be closed? All this sort of stuff. And then those operational centers make decisions about what needs to happen. So they will control the road signs. So you see the road sign in the middle that says, do not use closed lanes. Those are all controlled by these operations centers who make decisions on what to show on those signs. And people will then use that to inform their journeys. Now that's what's currently in place, but there's lots of trials going on and lots of development projects about, rather than putting it onto road signs, actually what you want is people to have that information directly, and you want it to be relevant and personal to them as well. So if it's linked into their sat navs or to their smartphones or whatever they're using to navigate, they can then more effectively get around. So that's possible today, and there's the trial that shows there, the A2M2 connected corridor, was one of the trials that proved a few years ago that we could do that. The challenge is more now about linking up all the different systems, because currently if you buy, say, a BMW and drive it around, you'll get lots of information about other BMWs and whether they've broken down, but you won't get information about whether someone in a Ford has broken down, because those two systems don't talk to one another. So a lot of work that's going on at the moment is to link all of that up, so that no matter what car you're driving or what part of the road network you're on, you're informed about what's happening, and you can change your journey if you need to. And on the bottom left, I took a snapshot. Actually, this is my phone, because I thought, well, how do I make the point that everybody is using apps now? I thought, well, I must be using them, and I didn't even really think about it too much. But I put a snapshot of it, and there's a couple of examples here. So GWR is Great Western Rail, so I use that for trains to see live train times, book train tickets, and see when delays are going on. First Bus is very similar, but just for buses. My Permit are used for booking car parking spaces and changing those in live time as well. Ryanair and EasyJet are flight booking apps, and then Uber is obviously for taxis. So I thought, well, that's all the different modes of transport I tend to use, and all of that relies on data and connectivity. So without that, none of that would work, and I think we take a lot of that for granted. The new modes and business model. What do I mean here? So new modes or modes of transport is really, what do you use to get around? So car is the obvious one, but the picture on the top you can see there is quite a common analogy about how efficiently we currently use road space. So on the same number of people and how much space they take up fitting into cars or into bikes or into a bus. So it's a very simple way of saying the more people who use public transport or walking and cycling, the more space we have, and therefore the less congestion there's going to be. Now, obviously, that's very simplistic, and the reason that people drive is because it's convenient, and because, like I said before, often cities are designed to drive around it. So it's not as easy just to say, well, everyone should walk or cycle or take the bus if that infrastructure is not in place. So what's happening a lot in the UK and also in other places around the world is that authorities who are in charge of cities are trying to incentivize people to change modes of transport by converting infrastructure. So on the picture below, you have this is in Bath, actually, in the city that I live in. It's called the Two Tunnels Greenway, and it was an old abandoned railway that was then converted into what they're calling a greenway, which is for walking and cycling. And I think it's the longest underground cycling route in Europe. And it's used by people all the time now. We've used it before to go cycling through or running through, and it's quite a nice area now. But by doing that, the authority is incentivizing people to, rather than getting their cars and drive to the next destination, is to why not cycle there or why not walk there. Similarly to that, on the right-hand side, you've got this idea of mobility hubs. Now, as an idea, it's not really a new one, but it seems to be a growing trend at the moment, where cities are looking to try and co-locate services with access to transport. So thinking really about people in areas, what services they're trying to access, and then making it easy for them to use to cycle hire or buses or scooters or whatever it might be to access those services. So it's really about better urban planning. And the bottom right, so e-scooters, I did a quick Google search before this because I wasn't sure if e-scooters had become a big thing in Mexico.
I think some places, like main cities, like you'll have like those stations where you can like use them around, but like the infrastructure is not as great. Like you'll have too many bumps, and like the streets are kind of bad for like riding them around. But it would be great, like if like it was a thing, because there's so much fun to ride.
Yeah, well, no, thanks for that. That's really interesting. So yeah, I mean, I went to Israel about 4 years ago or something, and I saw loads of these e-scooters were everywhere, and they were using all the cycle paths to get around. And over the last couple of years, they've become a real thing in the UK as well. And in our city, there's e-scooters. It started out as a trial, and it's become a permanent thing. And the reason I wanted to talk about them here is because it's also a new business model in that they're hired by the minute, and they're owned by a company who will then hire them out by the minute, and they will allow them to be picked up and dropped off within a certain area, and people will just have a subscription that they use, or just pay as you go and use them. But then initially people were very skeptical about that because they thought, well, are they going to be safe? Are they going to cause chaos with cars and bikes, etc.? But they seem to have been an established thing now, and people quite like them. Linked to that, as I say, it's sort of about trends. But on the left-hand side, there's a piece of work that WSP were doing with one of the councils in England. There's as people have started working from home a lot more in particular, but just generally, people are using delivery services a whole lot more, things like Amazon, and they expect last mile deliveries to be very quick. So this is about what's called last mile deliveries, is how do you get things from the distribution center or the post office to your house without having to use vans or cars. And so the councils are looking at, what are the alternative low carbon last mile delivery solutions, be that by bike or be that by sort of click and collect type models. So lots of cities are looking at this and trying to solve this congestion problem they have with lots of small to medium vans driving around delivering packages. And on the right hand side, this is what's known as a mobility as a service app. So you might have come across this term before, mobility as a service. Basically what it is referring to is subscription models for transport. So this app called Whim, which is is live at the moment in some cities, including in Birmingham in the UK. You can pay a monthly subscription and you can get access to public transport, but also taxi, car rental, bike sharing, etc. And it's supposed to be for the equivalent amount of money or even possibly cheaper than what you would normally spend on owning a car. Now, they've had some challenges recently, particularly with the pandemic, because obviously people have been traveling less on public transport. But the other challenge they've had, I think, is that people don't tend to realize just how expensive it is to drive a car. So they don't think about, okay, well, I've got to buy the car, I've got to insure the car, I have to pay tax possibly, I have to pay for fuel. They don't add it all up and put it into a monthly subscription. So when they see the cost of a monthly subscription, they think it's very expensive. But in reality, it might be the same or even less than what they're paying currently. But it's an interesting one. So as an idea, it's great, but I think at the moment this is a challenge with perception around it, which actually brings me nicely onto the final point, which or the final trend, which is around changing attitudes and perceptions and behaviors. So some general points around this. I mean, the image you see there is from the Extinction Rebellion protests from 2019, if you remember those. And just a general point that people are more aware of what's happening around the world, more aware of the decisions the governments are taking, more aware of issues like climate change and sustainability. And people are demanding certain things happen and are more willing to be vocal about that. So they're more aware of things like the picture on the bottom left, the emissions from the different modes of transport and what's high emission and what's slightly lower emission. And it's driving decision making, and it's just driving change in what people are doing. So on the right hand side, linked to that is the number of plug-in vehicles registered in the UK, which you can see is exponentially rising. And I mentioned before that the sale of new diesel and gasoline vehicles is going to be ruled out by 2030. So people are really being incentivized to make that shift into electric vehicles. A few other points around this. So some of these you might recognize, some you might not. But the general trend here we're seeing is that people want things on demand, but they also want things ideally local and sustainable. So you want to be able to use your app to order things like through the Rappi service or through Deliveroo, and you want it to arrive to your door, but ideally you don't want that to be contributing in a negative way to the environment. There's new services and business models popping up all over the time to try and address this. So HelloFresh on the right hand side, you may not have this in where you live, but it's certainly become really popular in the UK, which is where you rather than having to plan out your meals and go to the supermarket, buy them and bring them back, you just pick the meals. They get delivered to your door in a box, the fresh ingredients with the recipes, and then you cook them yourself. So business models like that impact on transport because they change journeys, they change how people act and how people travel and which services they use. So rather than having a couple of trips to the supermarket, you have one trip in a van to deliver to multiple homes these different boxes. So those sorts of things are impacting, and it relates back to the point about the last mile solutions as well, why that's become such a big trend. And the final point I wanted to make on this was obviously COVID and the pandemic had a massive impact, and it had a short-term impact, but I think it's also having a longer-term impact. So on the left-hand side, you've got this is from the UK back when the first wave of the pandemic hit 2020, and when the lockdown started. So you can see there that all transport initially completely dropped off, and people gradually got back into their cars because they didn't want to share the environment with others. And that trend has sort of continued. Although most of it has recovered, it's still, public transport use is still down based on statistics from before the pandemic. So people are more willing to get back into their cars than they are to get back into public transport. On the right hand side, the sort of more lasting element to this, you can use overlays in Google Maps now to understand where cases are rising in different parts of the country. And you can use that to inform your transport and decide the way you want to travel and where you want to travel. So, public health was never really taken into account in transport options before, and now it very much is. And that's something that may well see continue. So,
sorry, just one thing right there, just to add. I was reading on the New York Times how remote work would also cripple a lot of the public transport, because people won't have to go to the office the full 5 days. Instead, maybe it's 1 day or 2 days. So that was really gonna shift the dynamics of everything. So just wanted to add that really quick. Sorry, go ahead, Ollie, keep going.
No, that's fine, and that's a really good point. And I think it will certainly impact it. Whether it will cripple it is a really interesting point. I mean, Transport for London had this massive issue because in London, if you've ever visited, a lot of people traveling around using the tube, the metro, which is obviously a public transport system. But during the pandemic, people didn't want to travel on the metro because you're in a enclosed space with lots of other people. So their revenues were completely dropped off because people weren't buying tickets, they weren't using the metro, and that was what they used to survive, and that's what they used to subsidize all the other services like the buses and everything else. So they had a real problem around that, and they continue to have a lack of money essentially because people aren't fully back onto that. So I think in some cases that's definitely the case. In other cases it can be turned up and turned down, so you can run fewer services if you have less demand. But yeah, it's a really interesting point. So just to summarize, really, I mean, I talked a lot about lots of different topics, but my summary is that change needs to happen. We know that from some of the points we talked about, and it will and is happening. In some cases, it might need to be accelerated, but understanding the trends of change allows us to prepare for that future and also shape it and understand what needs to happen to enable it as well. And it's around those 5 trends that we're currently seeing the most change, and that's what we're preparing for. So more than happy to answer any questions that people have, or just to leave it there, but back over to you.
Yeah, I think like the process is like in the making, because for instance, a lot of like the car manufacturers in Germany, they were subsidized and they didn't have to follow like a lot of the newer regulations, because they're like, no, you're BMW, you're Mercedes, you're Porsche, like you keep doing like your thing. But they're starting to see like the competition roll out better cars, new models, and like it's interesting because like I think the main thing was the costs, like mainly like with the cars and other things like the electric skateboards and like the scooters and everything, like they were just too expensive. And like you need like the infrastructure and everything, but since it's more accessible, like the prices will lower, and I think people will like eventually shift to that because like that's where everything is going. So I think it's like a slow process, but for sure like needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Cost is a huge factor in all of it, and it's partly why I think that while we will continue to see some of these changes, the tipping points are really coming. I think we're seeing it now with electric vehicles. Actually, the tipping point is coming where the cost is becoming comparable. So while at the moment equivalent electric vehicles most of the time are more expensive than gasoline or diesel vehicles, they are getting increasingly cheaper. And that's where we're seeing an uptake of those electric vehicles, because people are suddenly realizing, actually, although the initial cost is more, the cost to run them is a lot cheaper. So I think you've got Andre, have you got a question? You got your hand up?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Really, really complete and nice. I really like it. I have a question. So in your opinion, what's going to happen like in the difference between countries that can afford these changes and can afford all of these new technologies, and countries that are even today, they are already behind on transportation? How are they going to even keep, the pace with these technologies becoming, well, they are expensive. So what's your opinion on that? How do you see it? I mean, you live in the UK, so that's very comfortable, but what about other countries, Africa, Asia, where that's probably not the case?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and I think it is going to be a challenge, particularly on some of these trends like like automation and like cleaner transport in particular, because as you say, with a transition to electric vehicles or even to hydrogen ones, for example, there is a lot of cost associated with the infrastructure in the first place, and as you say, like also the cost of the vehicles themselves. I think there will be a lag on that where you'll see to more less automated or fewer electric vehicles arise in countries where that infrastructure doesn't exist, because it won't be practical for that to happen. But I think you'll also, because of the way that we're all connected at the moment from communications and everything, the changing attitudes theme is a really important one, because I think what you'll see is people will see these changes occurring in other places and start to question, well, why can't that be happening here? And you might get the sort of push from the general public to actually make some of that happen. Or you might see even different versions of those happen in different places, where where people are demanding that change occurs, but it's not feasible for people in that country to adopt it in the same way as others. So I think you'll definitely see the same, or you will see change, but it might lag behind in terms of the expensive technology that you mentioned there as well. And you might see new business models around that actually as well, in that you'll see things emerge which are more feasible for particular areas. I mean, another one that I didn't really talk about was bus rapid transit is becoming a bit of a theme as well, where rather than having fixed bus routes, you have bus routes which are variable and people can jump on and off. That is actually already really widespread in a lot of developing countries, because it's just an informal way of using transport, whereas in more developed countries, people like to have schedules and people stick to schedules, and that's just the way that things work. And bus rapid transit is a completely different idea to them. So you see different trends in different places.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Ollie, we have a couple of questions here in the chat. Ana Paula Hernandez asks, what is the best option of transportation that we have nowadays?
What is the best one that we have nowadays?
Yep, the best option.
Well, it depends sort of where you're trying to go. So I mean, the best one would be walking, really. If you could walk anywhere, that would be ideal. You wouldn't have to use any kind of technology to get around. But the reality is that many of us don't live where we work, and we don't live where our family lives or our friends live. So you need to have a method of transport. But in terms of for the world and for the environment and for the planet, it's the cleaner transport, the better, and the more efficient would be to be using electric public transport, for example, that's powered by renewable resources. That would be the ideal. But the reality is, obviously, it differs hugely from urban environments to rural environments and what technology you have available. Where even in richer countries, it's not completely solved. We own a car because we know we can't get to some places without having a car, or it's very difficult to get to places without having a car, because public transport networks, while they're good, they don't serve every single case in every single way. So the ideal would be if you could get around everywhere walking, or maybe cycling, or whatever it might be. But the reality is it's always going to be a mix.
Okay, thank you. Daniel asks, how long will it take to replace our old vehicles with these new vehicles?
So I think the average age of a vehicle on the road today is about 7 years old, 8 years old, something like that. So that's the average time that people will replace their vehicles. Obviously, it depends on individuals, and also that business models one comes into it. So another part of the changing attitudes and business models is that more people are leasing cars now rather than buying them, because it's expensive to buy a car. And I think that will increase as you get more and more intelligent and expensive vehicles, because as you put more technology into vehicles, they become more expensive. Obviously, the technology reduces the price over time as well, but generally speaking, the more technology you put, the more expensive it is. So it's not that feasible to buy it and own it anymore. So so back to that question of how long it will take, it's very difficult to say, but I think it will depend on whether you plan to buy a car and hold on to it, in which case you might hold on to it longer because it's more expensive to buy a new one, so it might take 10 years or more, or whether you're happy, rather than owning a car, actually leasing a car, in which case it might be a lot quicker.
Okay, and a follow-up question, it says, what will be the first consequence that will appear with this replacement of these vehicles?
First consequence will appear. It's well, hopefully the first consequence, the consequences that we want to appear will be a reduction in road deaths and a reduction in transport emissions that cause global warming. That's the consequences we want to occur. I'm sure there will be other unintended consequences that come along with it, but yes, it's difficult to say. Yeah, yeah, hard to answer that one beyond that one.
Okay, very good. I don't know if any of you guys, Max, you had a question a couple of slides ago. I don't know if it was solved or if that's okay. If anyone else wants to ask, Ollie.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Ollie if you would be comfortable like riding a fully like automated like vehicle. Like, do you think technology's like reached that point, or would you still be like a little hectic? For example, like in like planes, like they already have like the automatic pilot, but like they always keep the pilots there. Like you always need the physical person. And like, for example, my dad, he's like, I would not let a machine like drive the car. So I was wondering, like you, would you feel comfortable like in a fully automated car or no?
It's really interesting one. I think I would be. I mean, I have been in an automated car before and driven around, but in in controlled environments or where there's, like you say, there's a backup. But yeah, I think I would be, because I think I see a lot of the the testing that goes into this, and there's a lot of rigorous testing that goes into putting these ones. I think that it comes back to these sort of attitudes around it, because I completely get that people don't like to give up control of things like their own personal safety to automated systems or anything like that. But if you think about it, if you go on to metro systems or airport trains that transport between terminals, things like that, those are automated a lot of the time now. There are no drivers in those, and you don't really think about it because it just works. And I think we'll see more of it, even though people are less willing to accept fewer accidents, even if they are fewer, if they're automated, if you see what I mean. So they tend to hit the headlines more because people are scared of the idea of giving up control. But I think people will do that over time as people accept that it is safer.
I will not mind having a car that parks on its own. I'm terrible parking, so if I can give totally control of that, I will not mind. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very informative. I learned a lot. Even if I heard this talk a year ago, every time I learn more. And well, thanks all of you for joining. Remember, you have the agenda of the day 2 of the STEM week, so stay tuned. Tomorrow we have a great talk, right, Ollie, at what's the time? It's our 7:12 at noon. Yeah, it's noon. We'll have a talk about environmental design. And I invite you to stay participate in the workshops and all activities that we have planned for all of you. And thank you very much again, Ollie, for joining. And the rest of you, if you haven't, remember to call to record your attendance, type your name and your full name and ID here in the chat, just for us to have a record of who was at which talk. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you around then.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.